She was 23 when Fletcher Dane decided their life together was over. The decision was not delivered in person. It was communicated via a change of locks and a single typed sheet of A4 paper, folded once and tucked into the handle of her largest rock sample case. He left her cases on the doorstep of the flat they had shared. He left the heavy canvas and leather satchels filled with gneiss from the Louisian complex, with schist and granite from the Cairngorms. He left 3 weeks of her geological survey work sitting on the rain-slicked tile of a London apartment building's entryway, as if it were a milk delivery. The note was efficient. It informed her that their joint account had been closed, with the balance transferred to an account in his name only. It informed her that the lease, which he had shrewdly kept solely in his name, was now hers to vacate. It gave her 72 hours. He had, it stated, taken the liberty of placing her personal effects, clothing, books, toiletries, into storage, the details of which would be forwarded by his solicitor. He took the Scandinavian sofa they had chosen together. He took the mid-century dining table and the set of 6 chairs. He took the art from the walls, the Turkish rugs from the floors, the copper-bottomed pans from the kitchen. He took the shared photograph albums and the digital backups. Fletcher, a man who traded in commodity futures, was methodical. He understood quantifiable assets. He conducted an audit of their life and liquidated her share. He left her with the clothes she had taken to Scotland, her field equipment, and a little over £200 in her personal account. He forgot the engine house. He had never known about it, not really. She had mentioned it once, a crumbling granite shell on a cliff in Cornwall, left to her by her grandfather. Fletcher had smiled, the particular quality of his smile that was more a calculation than an expression of warmth, and said that Cornish heritage was a lovely little tourist trap, but it held no real economic value. He never asked about it again. It was an anecdote, a piece of charming, useless trivia about her. It was not an asset he could chart on a screen. And so he forgot. She had grown up understanding granite the way some children grow up understanding silence. It was the bedrock of her world, the fundamental truth upon which everything else was built. Her childhood visits to Cornwall were not holidays. They were immersions. Her grandfather, Jago Trevithick, was a man whose own substance seemed to have been quarried from the same earth he worked. He was the last in a line of men who had gone underground, chasing the dark, glittering veins of tin and copper that were the county's lifeblood and its lingering ache. He had worked at South Crofty, the last working tin mine in Cornwall, and he spoke of its closure not with bitterness, but with a deep, geological sorrow, as if a great fault line had finally given way in the soul of the land itself. He had seen the end of 300 years of history, had heard the water pumps switched off for the final time, and had felt the silence that followed as the deep levels began to flood, a slow, cold drowning of a world he had known intimately. His hands were maps of that world, the calluses like contour lines, the fine, ingrained dirt a permanent stratum of his identity. He taught her not just the names of the rocks, the Killas, the Elven, the Groen, but their character. He taught her how to read the land, to see the ghost of a lode in the color of the gorse, to feel the presence of a mine shaft in the slight dip of the turf beneath her feet. After the mine closed, Jago had taken his small redundancy payout and done something the other men considered foolish. He did not buy a pub or a fishing boat. He bought a ruin. On the cliffs near St. Just, overlooking the raw, churning power of the Atlantic, stood the skeletal remains of Wheel Prosper, a 19th-century engine house. It was a monument to failure, a mine that had never turned a profit, its engines silenced after only a few short years. But its granite walls were magnificent. They were built of massive, hand-cut blocks of moorstone, fitted together with a precision that spoke of immense pride and skill. The chimney stack, though truncated by a lightning strike decades ago, still stood like a defiant watchtower against the salt-laced wind. To Jago, it was not a ruin. It was a testament. It was a house built to contain fire and steam, to haul fortunes from the deep, and its strength was an echo of the men who had built it. He spent his weekends there, not restoring it to its former glory, that was impossible, but simply preserving it from further decay. He repointed the mortar, cleared the bracken from its base, and sat inside its roofless walls, watching the choughs circle in the updrafts. He was its custodian, its quiet keeper. He had left it to her in his will, a single line bequeathing her the deed to a structure most people saw as nothing more than a picturesque piece of industrial decay. She had met Fletcher at a university function. He was studying economics. She was finishing her geology degree. He was attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible. He listened. He asked questions about stratigraphy and mineralogy, and his eyes, the color of a clear, cold sea, seemed to genuinely light up when she spoke of crystalline structures and metamorphic rock. He had a clean, precise mind that she found calming. He brought order to things. He organized their finances, their social calendar, their future. He spoke of 5-year plans and investment portfolios. She, who understood time in epochs and eras, found his grasp of the immediate future reassuring. He seemed to value her mind, her specialized knowledge. But over time she came to realize he valued it as a novelty, an interesting data point. Her passion for the earth was, to him, an exotic hobby, like collecting rare stamps. When she tried to explain the deep, almost spiritual connection she felt to the Cornish landscape, to the legacy of men like Jago, he would pat her hand and say, "I know, darling. It's a wonderful story." He treated her history as a narrative, not a living part of her. He could not comprehend value that could not be entered into a spreadsheet. The slow, patient strength of granite, the resilience of a people tied to a hard land, the weight of a grandfather's legacy, these were things that had no ticker symbol. Their life together had been a quiet, gradual erosion of her core self, a process so slow she had mistaken it for love. The train journey from London Paddington to Penzance was a long, slow retreat through landscapes that grew progressively wilder and more familiar. She watched the manicured fields of the home counties bleed into the rolling hills of Somerset, then the red earth of Devon, until finally the train crossed the Tamar and she was home. The air changed. It tasted of salt and damp earth. With her last £200, she had paid for the ticket and a taxi from the station to the small solicitor's office in St. Just. The room smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Mr. Curnow was a man whose age was impossible to guess, with kind eyes behind thick spectacles. He had been Jago's solicitor for 40 years. "De Melza," he said, his voice a soft Cornish burr. "Your grandfather was a fine man, a man of substance. He would be glad you've come home." He didn't ask why she was there, her face pale with exhaustion, carrying only a rucksack and a canvas field bag. He simply saw Jago's granddaughter and understood that she needed sanctuary. He retrieved a heavy black deed box from a safe. Inside was a thick vellum document tied with a faded ribbon and a single, enormous iron key, its surface pitted with a century of rust. "Weal Prosper is yours. The deed is all in order." "Jago saw to that," Mr. Curnow explained. He pushed the key across the polished mahogany desk. "He said you would know what to do with it." She took the key. It was cold and impossibly heavy, a solid piece of history in her palm. The walk from the town to the cliffs was less than a mile, but it felt like a pilgrimage. The wind picked up as she left the shelter of the last cottages, a wild Atlantic gale that tore at her coat and whipped her hair across her face. And then she saw it. It stood exactly as she remembered, a stark gray silhouette against a sky the color of bruised slate. It was more ruinous than her memory had allowed. A section of the northern wall had collapsed inward, a jumble of massive granite blocks lying amidst a riot of gorse and brambles. The wind howled through the empty window arches, a low, mournful sound. It looked desolate, abandoned, a monument to loss. But as she drew closer, she saw what Jago had seen. She saw the integrity of the remaining walls, the sheer, stubborn mass of them. The granite was alive with lichen, silver and gold and brilliant orange, a slow, patient life clinging to the stone. This was not a place of death. It was a place of endurance. She used the heavy key on the thick wooden door Jago had installed decades ago. The lock was stiff, but with a hard shove of her shoulder, it groaned open. The interior was a single, vast space, open to the sky. The floor was packed earth and stone, littered with fallen slates and the debris of nesting birds. In the center was the massive granite plinth that had once supported the great beam of the pumping engine. Against one wall were the cavernous, arched openings of the boiler house. The air was cold and damp, but it felt solid, protected. It felt like a fortress. She dropped her rucksack and field bag onto the floor. This was it. This was everything she had left. She spent the first hour simply walking the perimeter, running her hands over the cold, rough-hewn stone. She remembered Jago's voice explaining how the engine worked, his large hands sketching diagrams in the air. The boiler house, he had said, was the heart of the operation, where fire and water were transformed into power. She stepped into the dark, arched space. It was drier here, more sheltered. Jago had used it as a makeshift workshop. An old wooden bench stood against the back wall, and a few rusty tools hung from nails hammered between the stones. She ran her hand along the wall, feeling the familiar texture of the granite. And then her fingers found it. A single block that was not quite flush with the others. It was a subtle difference, one that only a person who had been taught to read stone would notice. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She pushed at the block. It didn't move. She pushed again, using her shoulder, remembering Jago teaching her to use leverage. It shifted, scraping against its neighbors with a deep, grating sound. It was heavy, but it was loose. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. The block tilted forward, and she eased it to the ground. Behind it was a dark, square cavity, and inside that cavity sat a small, rectangular tin box, the kind that once held biscuits or tea, its lid sealed shut with a thick layer of wax. Her hands were trembling as she carried the box out into the pale light of the main engine house. She used the point of her geological hammer to break the wax seal and pry open the lid. The contents were packed tightly. On top was a folded piece of paper, stiff and yellowed with age. It was old mine survey paper, covered in Jago's familiar, blocky handwriting. She set it aside carefully and looked into the box. It was filled with bundles of old 20-pound notes, held together with faded elastic bands. Beneath the cash, wrapped in oilcloth, were dozens of gold sovereigns, their weight dense and satisfying in her palm. They felt like concentrated sunlight. She sat on the cold earth floor and counted. The cash amounted to 32,000 pounds. There were over 200 sovereigns. It was a fortune. It was enough. It was enough to begin again. With shaking fingers, she unfolded the letter. The ink was faded but clear. "My Demelza," it began. "If you are reading this, then you have come home when you needed to. I always knew you would. This place, this old engine house, it has a strong heart, just like you. Some will see it as a pile of stones, but we know better, don't we? We know that it is a story of work and hope, and that is a story worth saving. The money is from my working years, a little put by every week, for a day when the wind blew cold. That day is here for you now. Use it to make this place whole again. There is a stonemason in St. Just, name of Penrose. His father worked with my father. He is an honest man. He will know what to do with these walls. Do not be afraid of the work. The work will mend you. This house is not an asset, girl. It is an anchor. It will hold you fast in any storm. I am proud of you. Always was. Your loving grandfather, Jago." She held the letter to her chest and wept. She cried for Fletcher's cold efficiency, for the life that had been dismantled and packed away. She cried for the grandfather she missed with a physical ache. But mostly, she cried with a profound, grounding sense of relief. She was not adrift. She had an anchor. The next morning, she found the offices of Penrose and Son, stonemasons, in a small yard behind the town's main street. The yard was filled with stacks of granite, slate, and the sweet, dusty smell of lime. A man in his late 50s, his face weathered like the cliff tops and his hands as broad as Jago's, was chipping away at a block of stone with a hammer and chisel. He looked up as she approached. "Mr. Penrose?" "That's me." His eyes were a pale, clear blue. "My name is Demelza Trevithick. My grandfather was Jago Trevithick." The man put down his tools and wiped his hands on his dusty overalls. A slow smile spread across his face. "Jago's girl. I'll be. I haven't seen you since you were a little thing, chasing lizards on the hedge. Your grandfather was a good man, the best of them. What can I do for you, my dear?" She explained about the engine house, about the collapsed wall. He listened, nodding, his gaze never leaving her face. He did not ask for details about why she was there, alone. He simply accepted her presence as right and proper. I know the place. We'll prosper. Jago loved that old shell," he said. "A bugger of a job, that wall, but nothing that can't be put right. We'll need a winch for the big stones and a good lime mortar. The old way is the only way for a building like that." He quoted her a price that she knew instinctively was far too low. It was a price based not on the market, but on respect. "I want to help," she said, surprising herself. "I want to work with you. I want to learn." Mr. Penrose looked at her slender frame, and the geologist's softness of her hands, so different from his own. But he saw the set of her jaw, the clarity in her eyes. He saw Jago in her. "All right then," he said with a nod. "We start Monday. Be there at 7, and wear proper boots." The work was the hardest thing she had ever done. It was a brutal, physical education. The first week was spent clearing the collapsed section, hauling away rubble in a wheelbarrow, her muscles screaming in protest. Mr. Penrose taught her how to sort the stones, identifying the original quoins for the corners, the face stones, and the smaller fillers. He taught her the alchemy of lime mortar, the precise ratio of lime putty, sand, and aggregate, the importance of patience as it cured. He worked with a quiet, focused rhythm, and she learned to match it. Her days fell into a simple, satisfying pattern. The physical exertion of the work, the shared lunch of pasties and flasks of tea, the slow, visible progress as the wall began to rise again from its own ruins. She learned the language of the stone. She learned to feel for the right shape, to see how one block would lock into another. Her geologist's eye for structure found a new, practical application. She was not just observing. She was participating in the geology of the place. She was binding herself to it. The aches in her body became a familiar, welcome pain. The dirt under her fingernails felt more honest than anything she had known in London. She felt herself hardening, her body and her spirit finding a new, resilient strength. She was rebuilding the wall, and in doing so, she was rebuilding herself, stone by patient stone. In the evenings, she worked on the interior. She swept the floors clean, pulled the weeds from between the flagstones. She bought a simple cot, a camping stove, and a table and chair from a second-hand shop in Penzance. She used Jago's old workbench to repair the wooden door. She found a local glazier to fit simple, sturdy panes into the empty window arches, sealing the space against the worst of the wind and rain. The vast, empty shell began to feel like a home. It was Spartan, but it was hers. Every surface, every object was there because she had chosen it, cleaned it, or fixed it with her own 2 hands. After a month of hard labor, the wall was complete. It was a magnificent thing, a testament to their shared effort. It looked as if it had always been there, the new mortar a slightly lighter shade that would darken with time and weather, blending seamlessly with the old. "Your grandfather would be proud," Mr. Penrose said, standing back to admire their work. "You've got a good eye for it. You understand the stone." It was the highest compliment he could pay, and it filled her with a quiet, profound satisfaction. With the engine house secured, she found she needed more than just physical work. Her mind, trained for inquiry and analysis, was restless. She went to the local Mining Heritage Trust, a small museum and archive in Pendeen. The director, a woman named Eleanor Vance, had known of Jago. "He was a legend, your grandfather," she said. "He donated his entire collection of mineral samples to us before he passed. Some of the best specimens of cassiterite I've ever seen." When Eleanor learned of Demelza's qualifications, her eyes lit up. The museum's collection was vast and poorly catalogued. They couldn't afford a full-time geologist, but they desperately needed one. She offered Demelza a part-time contract, 3 days a week, to catalog and organize their mineral archives. The work was a perfect counterpoint to the physical labor at the engine house. Here, in the quiet, dusty archive, she reconnected with her professional self. She handled specimens collected 150 years ago, her fingers tracing the crystalline forms of minerals pulled from the very lodes that ran beneath her feet at Wheel Prosper. She was mapping the subterranean world, giving names and order to the hidden wealth of the land. The job rooted her even more deeply in the community and its history. She was no longer just a visitor or a returning descendant. She was a contributor, using her skills to preserve the collective memory of the place. On her days off, she began a new project. She took her drawing board, her survey equipment, and her notebooks, and she began to create a detailed geological and architectural study of the engine house. She drew the structure from every angle, capturing the precise coursing of the granite blocks, the elegant arch of the windows, the particular way the lichen grew on the north-facing wall. She surveyed the surrounding land, mapping the faint outlines of the old dressing floors, the filled-in shafts, the leats that had once carried water to the boilers. It was a work of love and science, a way of knowing the place as intimately as Jago had. As the seasons turned from winter to a raw, wind-swept spring, people began to find their way to her door. An old man who had worked with Jago at South Crofty came by, bringing a gift of fresh-caught mackerel and stories of the dry, 1,000 feet underground. A local artist came to ask permission to sketch the engine house and ended up staying for tea, talking about the quality of the light on the granite. The postman began to stop for a chat, sharing local gossip. They were a quiet, unobtrusive chorus, their visits a form of acceptance. They saw her not as a strange young woman living in a ruin, but as Jago's girl who had come home to look after the place. She was part of the landscape now, a feature of it, as permanent and right as the stone walls themselves. He arrived on a wild March morning. The sky was a maelstrom of racing gray clouds, and the sea was a furious, foaming white. A fierce wind flattened the tough grasses on the clifftop. Demelza was outside, rebuilding a low section of the perimeter wall that had collapsed in a winter storm. She was on her knees, trowel in hand, her face smudged with lime mortar, and her hair tied back in a messy knot. She was so absorbed in the rhythm of the work, selecting a stone, applying the mortar, tapping it into place, that she didn't hear the car until it was parked just yards away. It was a sleek, silver Mercedes, utterly alien in the rugged landscape. "Ma?" Fletcher got out. He was wearing a dark, expensive-looking cashmere coat and polished leather shoes that were immediately splattered with mud. His hair was perfectly styled, but the wind immediately began to tear it apart. He looked thin and tired and profoundly out of place. He stood for a moment, staring, his face a mask of bewilderment. He was looking at the engine house, at the new glass in the windows, the solid door, the perfectly repaired northern wall. He was looking at her. She did not stand up. She finished setting the stone she was holding, scraping away the excess mortar with a practiced flick of her trowel. Only then did she look up at him. "Fletcher," she said. Her voice was calm, carried on the wind. "Demelza," he said, taking a few hesitant steps closer. I had a hard time finding this place. I didn't realize. It's incredible." He gestured vaguely at the engine house. "I had no idea. You never told me it was like this." "You never asked," she replied, and picked up another stone, weighing it in her hands, feeling its balance. She did not stop her work. The simple, continuous motion of it grounded her. "No," he admitted, his gaze drifting from her to the solid wall she was building. "I suppose I didn't." He watched her for a long moment, a strange expression on his face. It was the look of a man who has miscalculated a market, who has discovered a hidden variable that invalidates all his previous data. "You know," he began, his voice strained above the wind, "when I heard you'd left London, I assumed. I don't know what I assumed, but not this. I wasn't thorough enough in my accounting." The admission was so perfectly him, so transactional, that she almost laughed. He saw the engine house, her work, her new life, as an overlooked asset on a balance sheet. He saw a miscalculation. He did not see a home or a legacy or a life rebuilt. He took another step closer, his expensive shoes sinking into the damp soil. "I've been thinking, Demelza, about us. I think I made a mistake. Perhaps there's something here that can be repaired." She finally put down her trowel and stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. She felt no anger, no bitterness. She felt a great, calm, geological distance. He was from a different stratum entirely, a man who lived on the surface of things. "No, Fletcher," she said, her voice clear and steady, not needing to be raised against the wind. "There isn't." It was not a rejection born of fury, but a statement of fact, as simple and irrefutable as the granite at her feet. He seemed to shrink a little inside his big coat. He had expected tears or anger or a negotiation. He did not know what to do with this quiet finality. He nodded once, a small, jerky motion. He turned without another word, walked back to his gleaming, out-of-place car, and drove away. She watched until the silver car disappeared over the rise, then she knelt and picked up her trowel again. There was work to be done. That evening the storm had passed. The sky was washed clean, a pale, translucent blue deepening to saffron in the west. The air was cold and still. Demelza climbed the stone steps inside the engine house that led to the top of the wall, and then scrambled up onto the massive granite base of the old chimney stack. She sat there, dangling her legs over the edge, 100 feet above the sea. The Atlantic stretched out before her, a vast breathing sheet of hammered pewter, catching the last of the sun's light. The water below churned gently around the rocks, whispering and sighing. She thought of Fletcher. She thought of his tidy, ordered world of numbers and projections, a world where everything had a price but nothing had any real weight. He could not see the value in a grandfather's story, in the patient strength of stone, in the slow, hard work of mending something that was broken. He saw only a ruin and dismissed it. He could not understand that some things, the most important things, are not owned but are simply kept. They are held in trust, a legacy of resilience, a connection to a place, a quiet understanding of one's own heart. She thought of Jago and the long line of Trevithick men and women before him who had clung to this hard strip of land between the moor and the sea. They had pulled a living from it, had endured its hardships, and had passed down a strength that was in her bones, as much a part of her as the minerals in her blood. This place was her inheritance, not the stone and mortar, but the story it told, a story of endurance. The sun touched the horizon, a perfect molten disk, and a path of brilliant gold spread across the water, leading from the edge of the world directly to her. She sat in the deepening twilight, held fast by the granite, and felt a profound and unshakable sense of peace. She was home. Fletcher Dane had taken everything he could count. He had taken the balance of the bank account, the documented value of the furniture, the insured worth of their shared possessions. He had left behind the only thing that mattered. He had left the wind and the salt spray. He had left the stories of the old men and the quiet respect of the new. He had left the weight of the iron key and the wisdom in a handwritten letter. He forgot the crumbling tin miner's engine house her grandfather left. It was the best thing he ever forgot.